It's very nice to have you with us. Natalia, would you like to say a few words before you pass the baton on to us?
Thank you very much, Vasilis. Dear members and friends of the Institute, good evening. It is a real pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. Thank you for being with us. A warm welcome to everyone joining us through live streaming. Today's event features an informative talk on geopolitics, a topic more relevant than ever. The world around us is changing quickly, and these global developments directly affect shipping and global trade. That is why today's discussion is both timely and important for all of us. To help us explore this subject, we are honored to have distinguished speakers with us today. I would like to thank Professor Athanasios Platias from University of Piraeus, Mr. Vasilis Mougis, where he will be the moderator from Doric Sea Brokers, and our president, Pouni Toza, who traveled to Greece especially for this event. Thank you all for being with us and for sharing your valuable knowledge and expertise. Also, I would like to sincerely thank our fellow member, Dimitris Patrikios, Managing Director of VESSIPS Greece, for once again hosting us here at the VESSIPS Auditorium. Thank you so much, Dimitris, for your continued support of the Institute. Last, I would also like to mention our chairman of the ICS Greek branch, Mr. Nicholas Chavliris, who unfortunately cannot be with us this evening due to business travel. We send him our warm regards and thank him for his support all these years. As I take my new role as Vice President of the Institute globally, my goal is simple: to keep our members connected, informed, and engaged. At the ICS Greek branch, we do this in practical ways. We organize events on relevant and timely topics, like tonight's. We also create opportunities for discussion and networking. I am very pleased to see representatives of our company members here today. Company membership is a new initiative for our branch. Through this scheme, we aim to grow our community and strengthen our links with the shipping industry. We are also developing closer cooperation with international organizations such as FONASBA and Intercargo. These partnerships bring strong benefits to our members, both individuals and companies. They provide access to exclusive networking, informative events, and enhance industry engagement. In addition, our partnership with the Charter Management Institute offers another important benefit. Members can access structured training and accreditation in key soft skills, including leadership, communication, and management. These skills are as important as technical skills. They will help shape the next generation of leaders in our industry. By offering these opportunities for learning and professional development, we aim to support both personal growth and long-term evolution of the shipping sector. Before we start, I would once again like to thank you all for being here today, both in person and online, and to thank our speakers for their valuable contribution. Thank you so much. After we finish the event, we are waiting all of you for our traditional pita cutting event. Thank you so much. I am sure you will enjoy our seminar today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Natalia. So, the global economy has grown threefold in the last 30 years since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, since the end of the Cold War. Standard of livings have risen twice. 1 billion people have been taken out of poverty. Trade has increased fivefold in the last 25 years. Shipping caters for 80% of this trade. One of the major geopolitical events of our century was China's admission to the World Trade Organization. I think all of us who were practicing shipping before this event were awaiting this Chinese giant to emerge. And actually it did. And it shook the world and shipping to its roots. I think all of us in shipping realized the relevance of China. And China was a country which spurred globalization. We're now sitting at the crossroads of potentially an era where this globalization is being questioned, the extent of the globalization, by the various forces which we will be discussing this evening. Is globalization giving way to a different order, where we're having new alliances being established between member states? Is multilateralism giving way to fragmented multilateralism? What is actually happening? Throughout all this turbulence, throughout all these changes, shipping has always been sailing all the currents. The surface currents, the underwater currents, all the currents, shipping has been asked to cater. Thanasi, Punit, I don't know, the last 3 years, geopolitics has given us so much that 30 years before were not apparent. Geopolitics was straightforward. Suddenly it's not. And tonight we will try and establish why, what are the currents at play, and I will hand over to Thanasi Platias, who will give us a deep dive in the surface currents and the undercurrents of geopolitics. This will give us a backdrop to be able to discuss the themes which we all discover in our day-to-day practice in the shipping industry. Thanasi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vasily, for the introduction. Thank you, Natalia, for the invitation. Thank you, Dimitris, for the hospitality. I'm delighted to be in this panel with my friend Punit, that he will bring a geo-economics perspective into the discussion. Vasily, geopolitics were always there, even when they were not apparent. For example, during the period of globalization, and I define this period from the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union to until 2017 with the election of Trump. That it was the period that trade exploded, wealth exploded, all these things that you described happened. But it happened under the umbrella of American dominance that were keeping the oceans open, so trade flourished because of one geopolitical condition, which has changed recently. But even when it was not apparent, geopolitics was always there. That's my argument. So I will try to cover 3-4 topics. First of all, some of the current geopolitical trends in order to show the disruption that is taking place. Second, to discuss risks associated with maritime trade, mostly having to do with choke points. The third issue, it's really geo-economics, how tariffs, sanctions, are being weaponized. Then, if we have time, I will try to cover the geopolitics of shipbuilding, because there is a lot of interesting developments taking place there, and also the geopolitics of shadow fleet. Time permitting, we will touch this thing. Okay. This is a mechanism that developed by the ancient Athenians. If you build ships and you manage to have thalassocracy, sea control, this allows you to control trade and also to provide security to allies or to your empire. This generates wealth. This wealth can be invested to more ships, and you become even stronger in sea control, thalassocracy, and you get a virtuous circle that power proliferates. That was the model that the Athenians used. That was the model that the Carthaginians used. That was the model that the Dutch used, the British, and now the Americans. That's the model that gives power, that creates power. And power is central in geopolitics. So if you have a model like this that creates power, it's a geopolitical turbo. The problem is that this model does not live forever. It's been challenged. And how is being challenged? By a rising competitor. In this case, the elephant in the room is China, as you said, that also tries to be its own thalassocracy, to control trade routes, to be able to offer advantages to allies, and essentially, you get a competitor. My argument is that in the next 10 years, this competition will define what's going on in geopolitics, but also what's going on in shipping, because this geopolitical competition takes place at the sea, and it impacts all of you. In the beginning, China cannot challenge the American thalassocracy, but it can deny access in certain periods. So the game of denial is being played right now. We will get to that in due process. Okay, this is the changes from, we had after World War II, the Cold War. The Americans prevailed, Soviet Union collapsed. It was a period of geopolitical competition, the Cold War, from the end of World War II to the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Then we had the period that you described, a period of wealth and trade, globalization. This period has ended. What defines the new period? I call it fractured globalization, because globalization is still here, but it's fragmented. And we have a hybrid international system characterized by three things. At the very top, you have the geopolitical competition of the United States and China, so you have elements of bipolarity. At the same time, you have other important actors like Russia and Europe. And then at the third level, you have a lot of middle powers acting independently from the two superpowers. So you have elements of bipolarity, multipolarity, and polycentrism at the same time. So the international system, it's hybrid. The new Cold War, essentially, it's defined by the competition of the global East with the global West. Or it used to be until Trump came into power, which is dividing the West. But the basic point is that United States, Europe, and allies like Japan, South Korea, and Australia, it's part of the global West that are competing with the global East, that now the leader of the global East is not the Soviet Union or Russia, it's China, and has an axis with Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and this axis is strong enough to gravitate a lot of countries in Asia. So that's the basic competition. It has some elements, this, which I call the new Cold War, that they are similar to the old Cold War: technological competition, political subversion, strategic competition. But the most important thing is the differences. There are important differences. During the first Cold War, economies were not interconnected. Now, after globalization, economies are interconnected. And because they are interconnected, they are weaponized. Every link, every dependence, every interdependence become a weapon and is being used. And shipping has been weaponized. And the second most important characteristic is that the middle powers act independently. So Turkey, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Russia, they act independently from their main alliance. So the system has become much more complex. Now, if you see where conflicts are taking place, or potential conflicts are taking place, is the place where East meets West. This geographical land, we call him Rimland, which is essentially the periphery around Eurasia. So you see all the conflicts taking place there. For Ukraine, between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. Then we have the instability in the Aegean. Then we have the instability in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. Then we have the instability in the Persian Gulf. Then we have strategic competition in the Indian Ocean. Then we have instability and competition in Southeast China Sea. Then if we continue in East China Sea with Taiwan, and then goes up in the Arctic. So you see all the periphery around Eurasia is the area of contention where all conflicts and potential conflicts are taking place. Now, the elephant in the room, as Vasilis described, is the rise of China. The rise of China is so dramatic that look what happened in the last 20 years. China economically had a fraction of the US GDP. 10 years later, they were in equal footing. Now, Chinese economy, in PPP terms, in buying power terms, it's 25% larger than China. That's seismic. That's a sea change. And this underlying foundation, it brings that China it has the double industrial capacity compared to the United States. It consumes the double energy compared to the United States. And is building a fleet that in the end of the decade will be 50% larger than the American. Hence, what I described in the beginning, a competition who will control the sea. Now, you see the trend is working in favor of China. So the Americans concluded that this trend will continue in the next 10 years. So the United States will lose. So what they decided to do? To disrupt the system. To disrupt actually the order that they built after World War II, which we call it the liberal international world order, that it worked in favor of the United States for a period, but recently, in the last 20 years in particular, started working in favor of China. So Trump decided to destroy it. Because disruption, which is the new word, will create the preconditions for the United States to compete. Okay, let's see the plan of the United States, how to compete with China. All this derives for the new national security strategy that was published in the end of the year and the actions that Trump has taken in the last 4 weeks. The basic problem is China. You see the small red there? That's the enemy. But how you deal with this enemy? You have to prioritize ends and means. And the United States had decided to reduce its commitment in Europe and the Middle East and consolidate its power in the Western Hemisphere, number one. You see in the map, number one. That's the Western Hemisphere. So the strategy is consolidation in order to be able to compete. That's the old Monroe Doctrine, but with a Trump corollary. What it means? That you throw China out of the Western Hemisphere. That's the strategy. That has happened already in Venezuela. There are pressures to Panama, which were very successful, to throw out the Chinese company that controlling two posts and coerce all other Central and South American countries to cut relations with China, not in trade, but in infrastructure. So it's really a geo-economic instrument in order first to consolidate your power, but also reduce the power of the opponent. The strategy has been called rollback. Roll back the Chinese influence. Now, in order to deal with China, you have to beef up your allies around China, which is the containment strategy, which means you beef up South Korea, mostly Japan, Taiwan, and Australia. The second enemy is Soviet Union, Russia. But Russia is weak, declining superpower. Cannot even manage to get a win in Ukraine. After 4 years' war, it has occupied only 11% of Ukraine. The rest, it was done in 2014, when it got Crimea and part of Donbass. So for the United States, Russia is not a problem. The Europeans are big enough to deal with it. The Europeans have an advantage economically 12-1 compared to Russia, and demographically 1-3. So what the Americans say to the Europeans, you don't need us. We have other business in the East. So you take care of yourself. We disengage. So that's the strategy, which already it's evolving. And on Middle East, it's more or less the same thing. Disengagement, but provided that no opponent will be able to get the energy resources of the Middle East. And fifth is Africa. We don't care about Africa. That's what they say. It's one small paragraph in the end of the document that said, let's economize the resources. Let's not deal with Africa. So that's the strategy, and this is revolutionary. This is changing the international system as it operated, and as Carney said recently in Davos, this is rupture. This is disruption. Now, how all this disruption affects shipping? You all know that 80% of the maritime trade, it moves through the sea. But about 70% of that trade goes through choke points. So choke points can be easily weaponized. These are the characteristics of choke points, all of them very narrow straits that can be easily disturbed. So what I have done here, I put on the one axis the choke points, and on the other certain threats that can develop from low to high. As you can see, the dark blue is the high threats. All choke points can be influenced by high threats. So choke points is an easy instrument to weaponize, because essentially it disturbs 70% of the maritime trade. So the weaponization of shipping takes place at 3 different levels. One, using military power. And look who is using military power. Countries states powerful like Russia, Ukraine, that use the latest technology against defenseless ships, or ports, or infrastructure. Look what happened in the Black Sea. Ships were targeted, ports were targeted by top technology using state resources. And the Houthis, which is not a state actor, but essentially supported by a state actor. The second is hybrid warfare. It takes place around Taiwan, it takes place in South China Sea. We have new concepts like the Chinese maritime militia or the use of coast guards. And then there is psychological warfare. You create havoc, you take some ships for custody, and you create fear for ships to go in a certain corridors. So there are three levels at the same time that is being utilized. And my argument is that this is a kind of permanent disruption. It's not one thing. So shipping has to live with the permanent geopolitical disruption, which is actually take place in these zones: the Black Sea, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Horn of Africa. And there are zones that are ready to erupt. The most delicate and the most dangerous zone is South China Sea, but also East China Sea. The Arctic, as you can see recently, because of this discussion of Greenland, is becoming very top on the agenda. And the Eastern Mediterranean, as Greeks, you know all these things, what is happening with Turkey and its effort to try to control with the blue motherland doctrine, Eastern Mediterranean. Okay, let's look at the Red Sea. You have Iran supporting an axis of resistance, which has been disseminated. But the only axis, the only allies that has been not disseminated are the Houthis. Although the Americans decided to destroy them, they had a campaign for a month, but they failed. So the Houthis are still relevant, they sink ships, and look what's happened. I mean, from the moment that they started attacking ships in the Red Sea, 70% of the traffic was diverted. Of course, for the shipping industry, all this kind of disruption is good news, because essentially it means longer trips, it means less ships to hire, and the price of the asset is going up, and also the trading fees are going up. So, but you know, the disruption is there. It has to some extent normalized, but not completely. And all this thing that is being played out right now with Iran will affect Red Sea, because the Houthis, as I said, it's allies of Iran. So that's the diversion around Africa, which again, as I said, it's good news for the shipping industry. Another problem related to the same area has to do with piracy, and it's mostly in the exit of the Red Sea, in the Horn of Africa. Okay, Strait of Hormuz. Strait of Hormuz is not new to geopolitical disruption. The older of you may remember the tank war in the 80s, when we had the war between Iraq and Iran. About 300 ships were attacked. Right now, the Strait of Hormuz has been used as a threat. Actually, it's been used as a threat both by Iran, but also from the United States. Iran, last June, that was attacked by the Israelis and the Americans, threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz. It did not, because that would have hurt its ally in China, because most of the energy resources, and there are about 30% of the world energy resources that they pass through the strait, goes to Asia. The previous one, which I mentioned, the Red Sea, it's about 12% of the world trade. So disruption there was significant. Here, it's mostly energy trade. And as you can see, the energy trade goes to Asia. So disruption there, it will completely disrupt energy markets. But what is happening on Iran and what may happen to the Strait of Hormuz has negative impact on China. And don't forget the basic geopolitical competition as they described is China. What happened in Venezuela, the real target was not Maduro, it was China. What's happening in Iran, the main target is not the theocratic regime, it's China. Black Sea. Black Sea is actually more important than people have realized because it's an area that connects the Atlantic with the Indian Ocean. Look what happened when the Ukrainian war started 4 years ago. Trade was disturbed, mostly grain trade, but not only. This is not over. This picture is from The Economist last month when Ukraine managed to hit in one day 4 Russian-related ships, 3 in the Black Sea, 1 in the west coast of Africa. And immediately Putin said, well, we may occupy Odessa to get them out of sea access, and we will retaliate. You see the conflict in Ukraine, it's still producing all this kind of disruption. And one of the side effects of the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia has to do with the rise of shadow and the dark fleet, which is a target on its own. If we have time, I will get back to that. And by the way, the shadow and the dark fleet is being used in another geopolitical task to try to undermine subsea cable communication. About 95% of the global communications, including the internet, have to do with cables at the bottom of the sea. And these ships are being used deliberately in order to disrupt and destroy these cables. So the war in Ukraine, I'm not very optimistic. Even we have a trade deal, a peace deal, and Trump makes some nice photos. I think this will be a frozen conflict that it will stay with us for the years to come. So expect instability around the Black Sea. Potential zones of danger, as I said, the center of economic gravity has moved from Europe and the United States to Asia. Most of the growth takes place in Asia. And most of the people in the planet, 5 billion out of 8, live in Asia. And in this circle that I have put over there, they live more people than all the rest of the Earth combined. And most of the important trading activity takes place there, in South China Sea. More than 5 trillion trade per year, about 35% of the world trade, in terms of volume and in terms of value. And if you look where the most important container ports are, 8 out of 10 biggest in Earth are in this area. So you see, this is essentially the center of gravity of the planet in terms of economic. Therefore, what the geopolitical game about who controls South China Sea is central. And link that with what I said in the beginning about the competition between the US and China, or who will control the sea. And the most important part are choke points or sea corridors. And this is the number one important sea corridor in Earth. And in that corridor, South China Sea, there are competing claims. China said it's mine, like its own Monroe Doctrine. It claims 90%. It builds artificial islands. And essentially, it says that's my zone. Other countries have claims. So what you get is not real war, but cannons are being used. They throw water. But you see, it's an accident waiting to happen. And not only coast guards are taking place, it's just one level below military action, kinetic, but also hybrid warfare with maritime militia. Look every year how much the Chinese are increasing their activity in the area. And of course, this cannot go unchallenged by the West. So what the West is doing, it sends the cavalry. It sends flotillas with the head of one aircraft carrier having 40 smaller ships around it. And what it does, it stays for a couple of months and moves around, or then goes on the Taiwan Strait in order to say it's not yours, to say with force that this is open sea and we are determined to keep it open by military force. Again, this is an accident waiting to happen. The same takes place on the East China Sea. Okay, you hear all this discussion about Taiwan. Why Taiwan is so important? Have you ever wondered why all this geopolitical play between the US and China centers on Taiwan? There are two reasons. One is technological, because the most important chip producing company that gives the West and the United States an advantage on the artificial intelligence race, it's located in Taiwan. But that's not the most important reason. The most important reason is what you see. You see, if you are China, the red, and you try to break into the Pacific, you have a chain in front of you. And this chain is between Japan, Taiwan and Philippines. It's essentially choke points, which is very easy to block access into the Pacific. For the United States, if Taiwan becomes Chinese, and the Chinese say it's essentially one China policy that the US has recognized that it's one China policy. But the United States says it also has to be independent, although it's Chinese. And it's supporting militarily. And the idea is to block the Chinese access to the Pacific. Because for the United States, they remember what had happened when Japan got into the Pacific and got to Pearl Harbor and the Hawaii Islands, and they think the same thing will happen. So that's the problem there. And you see China at the same time try to impose its order by essentially making exercise that it essentially blocks Taiwan. So the number one scenario that we anticipated is not that the Chinese will go to invade Taiwan, but it will block it the way that the Americans blocked Cuba in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in that case, it will be the Americans that they have to take the first shot and essentially challenge the blockade. Again, it's an accident waiting to happen. And by the way, in this Taiwanese Strait, There's 20% of the global maritime trade. And again, like South China Sea, it's been challenged by the United States, its allies. Last week, it was a French warship passing through, and the Chinese were mad, to put it mildly. Okay, geopolitics of the Panama Canal. As all of you know, Trump claimed Panama Canal. Why? Because of the Chinese influence over there. So he threatened to occupy Panama unless Panama throws out the Chinese companies over there that they're controlling, the Hanchiso company that was controlling 2 ports. It happened last week. So coercion supplements military action. So in that case, they did not have to send troops. It worked through coercion. For the United States, Panama, it's internal waters, really, because in order to get from New York to LA, you have to pass through Panama. So for them, it's part of their corridor, of their maritime corridor. And most of the trade there takes place in the United States. So they think it's de facto theirs. Greenland. As you probably saw in the last couple of weeks, Trump claimed Greenland, and he threatened if it's not sold to him, it will occupy it militarily. The Europeans reacted, sending some symbolic force for reinforcement by 8 European states. Immediately, Trump reacted by increasing the tariffs in the states which is close allies, like UK, like France, like Denmark. So the Europeans went mad. So the whole thing de-escalated for a moment. I don't expect that this will go away that easily, neither the Europeans. So essentially, it de-escalated, but the problem, it's still there. Now, Greenland was always important for the United States. Actually, they almost bought Greenland the same date that they bought Alaska. But for domestic reasons, this trade did not materialize. They claim it after World War II by the Truman administration, after Eisenhower administration, and under Trump. During the Cold War, this gap between Greenland, Ireland, and the UK was the most important maritime corridor in Earth, because the Soviet submarines, in order to get into the Atlantic, they had to pass through this corridor. And it was the only way that the American radar and sonars will be able to identify and then being able to follow the Soviet submarines that they were central in nuclear strategy. And it was so important that the Americans have 10,000 troops in Greenland. Then they reduced the presence because of globalization, because of this period, which we call period of unipolarity. But recently, because of the melting of the ice, Greenland becomes very important on the polar route, which promises to minimize east-west transport by 35%. But most importantly, again, to control the Chinese and the Russian access into the Atlantic. And by the way, it's also the area that in case of nuclear war, Chinese or Russian ballistic missiles will pass through Greenland. So it's very important for the United States for a kind of Star War umbrella. So for this reason, I believe that the escalation that happened in Davos will not continue. Okay, let me now shift very briefly to or Geo-economics, so far I talk about disruption. These are structural changes. And the structural changes are taking place in this, the concept is decoupling. During the globalization era, the two economies were interconnected. This interconnectivity, according to the Americans, worked in favor of the Chinese. Therefore, they try to decouple the economies. They understand that total decoupling is impossible. So they aim for partial decoupling on the things like technology and everything that is important. In order to do the decoupling, they have to change the strategy of offshoring production and try to bring it back, or at least to friendly countries or nearby countries. So that's the structural game that is being played right now. International economy, of course, it influences shipping because it influences the trade patterns. One of the instruments is tariffs. Liberation Day, April 2, Trump imposed tariffs on every nation in Earth. The idea is to minimize trade with the US, and if you need access to the US in order to give concessions. And at the same time, bring the industrial base back. Now, you see one pronouncement, it immediately diminishes world trade because of the tariffs. Then, a month later, he said, well, we have 3 months pause. Then trade exploded. You see, just one declaration can impact maritime trade tremendously. Now, the basic, Trump can claim that has been already successful. The trade deficit has been halved by just the first 10 months. Industrial production has moved to the United States, even slightly, and revenues have risen. So for Trump, what he's doing, data is supporting his success. Now, how others are coping with this decoupling? There are 3 strategies. The most expensive strategy, even for American corporation, is to go back in the United States. The less costly option is to go in friendly or nearby states, from Mexico to India to Thailand to Vietnam. But the strategy that I think everybody has opted, or 90% of the companies have opted, is China +1. Maintain a relation with China, but build one alternative in case that they need to diversify, to reduce dependence from one supplier. In other words, we move from a world that efficiency was the #1 consideration to where resilience is the #1 consideration, even if it's costly. You cannot get China out of the equation. If you look carefully at this chart, it's a combination of the magnitude of its industrial base, but also the high level of what is producing that there's no other challenger to replicate. So you cannot get rid of China. So the strategy is China +1. Now, these are the changing patterns that we have seen during the last year. If you look carefully, the red lines have to do mostly with the United States, either in Canada or in Mexico or with Europe or with Asia. But you see, international trade is like a balloon. You push it in one direction, it explodes in other directions. And look what's happened. In all other places within the global south, within Asia, it exploded. So actually the Chinese, despite the economic warfare of Trump, they ended up with a surplus of 1.2 trillion. So these are more structural changes in trade that have to do with the United States, but also Russia, and to some extent the UK. Trade between US, Russia, and the UK is diminishing, and everything else is increasing. But look what most of the trade takes place in Asia. And this is the energy trade. Okay, a couple of words on the geopolitics of shipbuilding. As I said, Trump tries to get industrial production back. And shipbuilding is central, because in order to have thalassocracy, in order to control the seas, you must have industrial capacity. The United States had a kind of schizophrenic attitude. It completely destroyed its civilian naval industry and tried to maintain the best for defense purposes. The Chinese had a fusion between the military and the civilian, and this fusion helped them. And this fusion has propelled them in order to control last year the new builds around 64%. The Koreans are the only ones that are able to compete with about 29%. The Japanese are losing share. The US, they don't exist in this picture. And all the rest have less than 1% of the global market. Indians, Europeans, Vietnamese. So essentially, the Chinese dominance is here, and it's increasing year by year. So the United States trying to rebalance that. And one of the instruments was port fees. That ships built in China, they will have very expensive port fees when they visit the United States. The idea is to take this money of the port fees and throw it in the industry in order to subsidize it, in order to start having the industry. So that was the plan. The plan had one basic flaw, that shipbuilding is labor intensive. And the American boys, they are not going to go in American shipyards. You need Latinos, but Trump throws the Latinos out of the United States. If you see, one of the reasons that the Japanese have lost their competitive advantage is because of demographic reasons. One of the reasons that South Korea managed to maintain about 30% of global shipping is that it used the Asians, Indonesians, Malaysians, and actually it builds training centers in Malaysia and Indonesia before they move to Korea. So labor intensive, the US cannot solve this problem. And on top of it, that was important for the Chinese. So although Trump can coerce everybody, but not the Chinese, because the Chinese have one secret weapon, rare earths. And without rare earths, American industry, including defense industry, cannot work. So essentially, they threatened, if Trump imposes more tariffs, and if Trump insists on these port fees, they will withhold rare earths. And this worked. They met in Korea in 30th of October of last year. And not only Trump did not impose tariffs, he took the port fees out of the discussion. And on top of it, the Chinese coerced him to sell top NVIDIA chips. So you see, in this kind of poker game, essentially the United States lost because it thought that the advantage of having access to the American market was a trump card, but apparently the Chinese were holding the trump card, which essentially rare earths. Okay, I think I have laid a kind of big picture both on geopolitics and geoeconomics that will help us dive in and zoom in during the discussion period. Thank you very much.
Thanasi, that was a very good big picture assessment of where we are, where we've come from, and I think it's giving us a little bit of insights as to potentially where we may be heading. Punit, you've been following geoeconomics very closely, and I know that you like to zoom in to what's happening on the ground. So after this wonderful big picture view, I'd like to discuss 2 or 3 things with you, and then obviously you can take the discussion as you feel. But firstly, trade war and tariffs. This is something which has occupied all of us in the last year and a half, year or so. After what's happened, do you think that we have peaked in terms of tariffs? Are we likely to see things easing going forward? And what do you assess has been the impact of tariffs so far to shipping?
Right, so thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here in Greece. My congratulations to Natalia and to the Greek branch and everybody to really bring up event like this. I really feel that as a president of the ICS, I feel extremely proud to see these kind of events happening. I wish more branches will eventually follow this. Coming specifically to this topic, I also want to mention that while I am the president of the ICS, the interest in this topic is more to do with my teaching that I teach on geopolitics and shipping around, and I'm very happy that I'm also teaching at the University of Piraeus here. So it's a pleasure to be able to kind of talk about it. And you're right, Vasily. I think the idea is to try and understand that while Professor Dr. Platias has talked about a big picture space, one of the best things about that presentation, which by the way I've seen in parts before, but I love seeing the whole thing now, is the historical aspect of it. I think people tend to forget that history is very important in making the decisions today. Countries are doing that, but the countries making decisions is like the bow and arrow situation, right? I mentioned this earlier, that the bow is basically the policies of the government, and the arrow is you guys, the businesses. You are the ones who are actually shooting in that direction wherever the bow is telling you to go. And in my mind, coming back to your question, the tariffs, I believe, have been used in past purely for economic reasons. But today, as America is looking at it, they have changed the dynamics quite dramatically. So they are using tariffs as a way of getting people to comply with their requirements or requests. So in that case, have the tariffs peaked? I don't think so. Because as long as there is a wish list that America has, tariffs will always come into play. This is going to be a huge change in the mindset of people who are facing these tariffs. In my mind, people who are aware of these tariffs probably coming in will start factoring a degree of uncertainty that they did not earlier. As a business, I would start thinking, if my country's president is going to go and meet China tomorrow, what kind of implications will that bring in terms of tariffs or levies or penalties on my country and anything that I'm doing here? That's the first part. So tariffs are going to be something which are going to be centric to events happening, whether it's Canada signing a deal with the Chinese and having an impact on their tariffs as well. That's the first thing. Secondly, most importantly, the tariffs are also going to be something which are going to be a moving target. The South Koreans find it out recently that the 15% which they had budgeted for after signing a deal has suddenly become 25% just because Trump feels that they've not kept their end of the bargain. The problem is they don't know what their end of the bargain is because the deal itself is so fluid and ambiguous in some ways, right? So this is where there is going to be a bit of a challenge with regard to it. Specifically for shipping. Now shipping, I must add here that shipping is 2 things. One, adaptive. So whenever things happen, yes, there are challenges and there is an issue. There is some money which is exchanging spaces because of the fact that one is at a more commercial advantage than the others. So negotiations happen all the time. But that only means that shipping has to adapt and try and find the strongest person to do business with. which means that the goods are going to be shipped either way, in one direction or another. The shipping has to go ahead and service that. So I always say this to most of my students as well. Your first point of contact must be your customers. You try and find out where are your customers sourcing the goods from. Are they changing their sourcing because of tariffs? Are they changing the sources because of other reasons? Doesn't change anything. You have a ship and you can charter a ship wherever in the world as long as it is not restricted in some ways, and still service that same customer saying, no problem, you want to buy from this part of the world, I can give you a freight for that part of the world. The adaptability of shipping is because it's a global industry. Most of the other industries have assets which are fixed in a location. We have assets which are literally floating all over the world. So this is where shipping is unique. Secondly, from shipping's perspective, they have seen these things happen and they've always benefited from disruptions. When things go wrong, like the Houthi crisis, the rerouting of ships via Africa is a bonanza for the container industry, for the tanker industry, and essentially it sounds a bit cynical to say this, but shipping generally benefits from an inefficient operation, because the minute the inefficiency comes in, there is a change in terms of trade routes, the change in terms of routing, and obviously if it's inefficient, that will obviously create better value in terms of freight, which is going to be more than the previous efficient way of shipping the commodities. So in reality, I think tariffs are here to stay. They have not peaked, but they will come in surprise packages. And most importantly, shipping will adapt as it has always adopted. But most importantly, shipping will benefit from the disruptions, 100%, yeah.
I would agree with you. I think that we see it on, on the ground, so to speak, that shipping finds its way around because trade is fungible, so it adapts. What was interesting, Thanas, in one of your slides where Trump has been boasting about the gains that the tariffs have brought so far. It will be interesting to see how much of the additional revenue collected by the state has been actually collected from the importers and how much has actually been spared by the exporters. Because I read an analysis recently that 1% was put the loss to the exporter, and the rest of the revenues were actually paid by the importers. I don't know, Punit,
yep,
you
I
have
agree.
something to add to that?
It's been around the same level. There's been a foundation which is global foundation called Henrik Foundation, and they run some very interesting research studies on this very topic. What they're saying is even one more step. They are actually saying that the importers are saying, let's find ways to circumvent these tariffs because they're the ones paying the tariffs. So they're looking at transshipment options, they're looking at new certificate of origin options, they're also looking at other ways to try and bring the goods in from different destinations. And China is very happy to oblige in this case, yeah.
I think that was interesting. The other thing which I think is certainly in my mind is one of the most interesting developments in the last 15 months, ever since Trump was announced to become the new president in October of 2024. The US dollar has lost basically anything from 10 to 15%, depending on which currency it is measured against. We know in shipping that the dollar still being the major currency of trade actually stimulates trade as it weakens. We've done some analysis ourselves and we've correlated the BDI inversely to the weakness in the dollar. So in a sense, the dollar has lost, it would seem to be political capital more than anything else. Because as a trade currency, it's still the predominant currency. And I will get also to another interesting discussion to show you, we talk about, different currencies developing. And obviously the Chinese have been trying to, conduct trades in the renminbi. I have been in discussions with clients of ours in South Africa. South Africa is a country which is in BRICS, and they are shipping a lot of minerals to China. And one of the major miners there today, I actually checked and I said, do you actually transact in US dollars or in renminbi? He said, well, they asked us to do renminbis, but we're insisting on dollars, and we're actually able to trade in dollars. The Chinese will obviously trade in renminbi whatever is dodgy. So, you know, they are now the only buyers of crude potentially from Russia and from Iran. That is probably going to be in renminbi. But what I wanted to check with the two of you is, how do we see things? I mean, the dollar as a reserve currency has lost 15 to 20% in the last 20 years as a reserve currency. Governments have gone into gold, they've gone into all sorts of other. If the dollar loses its relevance further in the global arena, then the weaponization and the turbulence which Trump or Trump-like tactics are able to effect on different countries will not be as impactful. I don't know how you see that unfolding in a bigger geopolitical scheme of things.
Well, it's clear that the Trump administration wants a weaker dollar, and it's happening. So it's good for trade, as you said. The negative thing is that the United States is weaponizing not only the dollar, but all the financial infrastructure. Let's say SWIFT. And it's the sanctions, not only primary sanctions, but also secondary sanctions, or getting grab of your account, or to anyone that the Americans don't like, create incentives for others to find alternative. The dollar is still strong, about 60% of or more of the gold reserve currency. So I don't think it will diminish soon. But you know, if the Americans keep weaponize it the way that they do, it's a law in international politics. When you have somebody using power, it will be resistance, and it's going to be balance of power. So the same thing will happen there. So the Americans have to be very careful the way that they weaponize the dollar and the financial infrastructure, because they may overreach.
Punit, you're based in Singapore, you're out there, you're
Yeah, so I see the fact that the global space is very much still dollar denominated at this point of time. At least when it comes to shipping specifically, I can say it's still dollar denominated. But I just want to comment on this from an ecosystem perspective. Please understand that the US dollar is basically a symbol of American ecosystem or economic impact across the globe. So there are lots of other factors which create that dollar dominance so far. One of them, as just an example, used to be the aid that US government used to provide to all these countries. The US aid, and South Africa is a good question, US aid to South Africa was $1 billion for just HIV testing every year. Overnight, Trump stopped that completely because he just felt this is a waste of money. Why should I pay these guys? I don't like South Africa anyway. So let's cut the $1 billion off. Who stepped in? 500 million comes from Europe now, and 500 million comes from China. Immediately, the trade has changed as well. So South Africans are doing much more business with the Chinese and the EU with all those chrome ore, manganese ore, and other parcels moving around. So this is where I believe the dollar is basically a kind of a front line of the other aspects that America was involved in. Whether it's a multilateral organization, chairmanship, membership, which is now it's left all the bodies that it's withdrawing from, where China and others are starting to take center stage and fill up the vacuum. So there is a process that is going on internally within America, which is creating a degree of isolation for America in long run. If that actually happens, then dollar will decline automatically. And the interesting part is that most of the treasuries are held by Chinese and Japanese today. And the Chinese have already just this morning told most of the investors in US bonds, the government bonds, to reduce their exposure and replace it with gold. Of course, there's a verbal discussion with these people, but that only goes to show that they're preparing for the evident collapse, not collapse, but at least decline of dollar going forward. That will be a big change for us. The other thing that's interesting with BRICS that you mentioned is that now with the expanded BRICS, Iran and Russia are both in the same. The original BRICS didn't have Iran. This one has Iran and Russia. Both of them cannot use the dollar. So what they do is they denominate the value of the commodities in US dollars, and then they simply do a barter swap, saying you take this and I take this commodity from you, but the actual denomination of value which is bartered is in US dollars even today. So that's the way it's changing the trades completely. Fascinating, yeah.
It is very much so. Thanasi, another one of your slides, very interesting. You brought up, obviously, Taiwan and how Trump and his policy is now becoming more American or within the Western sort of hemisphere focused. So his attention starts becoming Latin America, Venezuela, Greenland, all this Western hemisphere. The Chinese, as always, they've been keeping quiet and biding their power, so to speak, to use an old Confucian adage. So they've been very quiet. What's happened with Venezuela was very interesting to note that you consider this something, which was a sort of it was a Chinese affair more than anything else. And my question, because shipping and Taiwan, and what happens with Taiwan in the next year, 2 or 3 years, or whenever. I read a report about a year ago that if the Chinese were to take Taiwan by force, you would probably have a collapse of global GDP by 10%. The global financial crisis and the recession of 1929 will pale in indifference. My question, do you think that the way things are unfolding, the Chinese are happy? They acquiesce to the way the Americans are working around the Americas, and they are hoping that this will give them the opportunity to take Taiwan with less force and with not as much challenge. Because if Mr. Trump and the Americas are saying, this is our hemisphere, this is what we're going to be looking after, then the default is potentially that they're losing a little bit of their interest in that part of the world. As important as you've described to us that it is. Is that something which is a scenario which could potentially play out, or do you think it's too big an issue to actually have such a outcome?
Well, by accident, I visited China the very day that Trump was elected. And I stayed there for about 2 weeks. And I met think tankers, government officials, and university types. Everybody was happy that Trump was elected. They thought that it's easier for them to deal with a transactional president compared to an ideological president like Biden. And the way that their negotiation with Trump played out, I think it proved their point. Chinese are happy with what's going on with war in Ukraine because it shifted Russia to become a satellite of China. The Chinese are very happy that Trump, and by the way, it's not just Trump, I mean, it's American government. And some of what I described and I attributed to Trump, I think they have a consensus in Washington. The only thing that, from what I described, that doesn't have a consensus in Washington is what Trump is doing to divide the West, the way that he's provoking, for example, his allies, mostly in Europe. But in everything else, they agree. So Chinese are happy with Trump dividing the Western alliance. It's killing American soft power. And this thing about Monroe Doctrine and sphere of influence is music to their ears, because that's precisely what they want to do. And I explain the 9-dash line in South China Sea, which they claim, it's their Monroe Doctrine. And when it comes to Taiwan, which even the United States has recognized that it's one China policy, they have the upper hand to do what you described, compare what the Americans did in Venezuela. So having said that, they read carefully what the Americans are saying. And you see, even if this national security strategy was very ideological, the 2 or 3 paragraphs that were related to Taiwan, they were very mainstream, very unlike Trump. Let's put it this way, in the think tank world and in the Washington world, everybody expects Trump to sell Taiwan for a deal. I mean, that's the prevailing atmosphere, that if Trump gets a good deal on other things, it will easily sacrifice Taiwan. That's the kind of prevailing wisdom. But you see, if you read the strategy, it just states American traditional policy all these years. Now, from a Chinese perspective, I think they feel that time is working on their favor. And actually, if they read the American grand strategy, the Americans say that time is working in favor of the Chinese. That's why, as I explained, they want to disrupt the system. So, and the Chinese are patient. Deng Xiaoping said, you know, we can wait 1 century, 2 centuries, 3 centuries, but Taiwan will get Chinese. I think unlike Trump, which is impatient and he wants fast deals, the Chinese plays for the long run. Look, I mean, at their planning. 5-year plan, 6 5-year plan, 7 5-year plan. The Americans are changing, you know, with each administration strategy. So they think that their political system, it's better for planning for the long run. So in my mind, they will wait. It will be stupid for them to take risks, because for reputational and other costs, the US will have to respond. Even if Trump wants to give it up, they will make it hell for him. So the US will have to respond. And if it responds, the spiral of escalation, it's crystal clear. And you see in the current security environment, you cannot really isolate conventional military conflict or nuclear, because the same basis that they have the conventional capabilities, they also have nuclear weapon. I mean, the American aircraft carriers that I explained, they do have nuclear weapons. So sinking one aircraft carrier there immediately escalates the whole thing. So I think the Chinese have played it conservative, and they will continue to try to undermine internally the political system of Taiwan. So unification will come in a Sun Tzu fashion. You win without a war.
Wonderful. Before we go to questions, Punit, what I'd like you to just give us a snapshot. We spoke about Canada, and we were discussing earlier on about the reliance the US has on heavy sour oil. And Canada and Venezuela play into that mix of things. For the benefit of the audience, and it's obviously, it shows the extent of how shipping and trade sort of unfolds and is fungible. Can you please give us that insight with the pipeline, what I've read about in one of your articles?
Absolutely. I think that was about a year and a half back that I started talking about these ideas. And the Canadian pipeline extension was planned by Canada during the first Trump term, Trump 1.0. And they had already seen that, of somebody who can pretty much tear up the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and rewrite it as USMCA, which by the way is torn up again. But the idea is that they were forewarned that this is not going to get any better. Things are getting pretty tough as such. They never expected it to be like this, but they were expecting challenges. So when they extended the pipeline, the Trans-Canadian pipeline, so all the crude is mostly in Alberta province and then effectively comes to Vancouver through the pipeline. They have got most of the original first pipeline crude going to US, and even the second one was catered for mostly American business. And like Vasily mentioned, 60%, I think 60% of the American refineries are dependent on heavy crude, which was basically Canadian sourced, coming through pipelines and mostly Aframax tankers. Now herein lies the challenge that Canadians saw that this is writing on the wall. We would like to see this eventually change the dependence on US as a sole customer. So they brought in Asian companies into the mix for the extension. And today, they probably have a smart or thanking their stars that they did that, because now a lot of the Canadian crude has started flowing towards China. To the extent where the Baltic Exchange in the last 6 months have brought 2 new routes on the tankers from Canada to Asia, only to cater for these additional trades that have come up, right? And this is a huge plus for shipping industry, because obviously that Canadian crude, which used to travel hardly any distance to US Midwest, is now suddenly going all the way to China, keeping an Aframax away for 75 to 90 days, as against something that would basically be a very short trip and coming back to Vancouver. So herein lies the dynamics of neighborly relations going sour. And this is going to impact everything from cars to whatever you name it, that this is going to create huge challenges. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why Venezuela was crucial, because Venezuela is an alternate to Canada for American refineries of heavy crude. It is a bit more dicey to refine Venezuelan oil, but it is possible to replace that with the Canadian oil that is lost, I would say. So these dynamics play a huge role in how the trades for shipping flow. The interesting is, like most of you would talk about, shipping is agnostic. As long as it is not illegal, we would ship it. and it doesn't really matter where the trade flows move. We would follow those trade flows quite closely, and most of the time benefit from these trade flows. Yeah, absolutely. I just had one small point on the American-China and the Taiwan factor. Just wanted to mention this, that the Americans have actually been more vocal on every single one of these things. And sitting in Asia, we see that China is very quiet. And they know that exactly what Dr. Platias was saying. They know that this is basically a game in which they have to be patient, let the Trump administration run out of steam in multiple areas, and then they will step in and just fill the void from time to time. They are not going to take any drastic actions, but they are definitely keeping the territory very close to them. And something like what happened with Maduro in Venezuela is a great symbol for them, saying that if somebody is wanted as a criminal in your country, you just go ahead and abduct the guy and bring him to your country. It's a great blueprint for lots of things that these guys can do. So they're actually happy with the way things are going at the moment. The only problem they have is internally the economy is bleeding, because real estate is a big driver of infrastructure, and that is not really doing that well. So internally, they need to solve problems. The military purge and everything else that you talk about, they're trying to set their house in order, preparing for wartime, before wartime, trying to get the peacetime sorted out, which for them is basically now for the next 5 years. Yep.
Very interesting. Before we take questions, you spoke about the real estate market in China, and I'd like to share something with you. Being in the dry cargo space, we've been hearing for a while now that the steel industry is going to be impacted because the real estate sector of China is going through a depression. And we know it. The statistics are there. Buildings which are unoccupied, real estate companies which have gone out of business. Less steel is going into real estate and projects in China. And yet, the Chinese are importing a lot more iron ore, coal, in increasing amounts, not to speak about bauxite for aluminium. So one is puzzled. Why? Why are they importing all this iron ore and coal And what are they doing with it? Well, I looked into an analysis. Today, 17% of the steel produced in China goes into the real estate and the construction business in China. 37% goes towards their global infrastructure projects. So the Belt and Road Initiative, which we all know about, and this is what has been described and maybe not said, but this is what the Chinese have planned, is today absorbing 37% of the steel which is produced in China. And this has been increasing. And we know, Punit, from day-to-day trading, bulk carriers are shipping steels, container ships are shipping all sorts of commodities from China, feeding their global infrastructure project. It just goes to show you the extent of how they've planned this development of theirs through these 5-year programs which you've spoken about, and how much of the stuff which is happening doesn't meet the eye, and we get caught by the headline, the property market is in malice, steel is going to be depressed. Punit,
Absolutely.
What do you think?
No, I absolutely agree with you. I think the BRI is, let's look at the kind of expanse that they've got. 151 countries, okay? We're talking about a huge amount of infrastructure being developed. Africa has not even started the journey of going to that space where we want it to be. So, and China has a huge influence there. But I just had a very funny anecdote about real estate. Many years ago when technology was not like it today, we had a guy from Morgan Stanley China come and talk to us in Clavenes. And one of the questions that he actually answered for us was, is the real estate really in crisis at the time? This was just around the big crisis in 2008, 2009. And he said it is going to be in crisis. This is going to be a huge shock to the system, and real estate is already over-leveraged in a big way. And we said, what kind of indicators do you have? Because official figures don't tell us anything. You know what he did? He went and saw the power bills, the electricity bills of all the apartments in Shanghai, and found out which were the apartments which had zero electricity bills for the last 6 months. And those were the unoccupied percentage. And then he found out that maybe 73% of the apartments did not have any electricity bills for the last 6 months. That meant that they were unoccupied and bought only for speculation purposes. And eventually that market collapsed. So it's a great idea to try and look at data, but also be careful what data is being looked at, because otherwise you'll be looking at the wrong end of the stick. Yep.
Well, let me make a comment on BRI, the Silk Road. It looks imperialistic Chinese scheme in order to extend their influence. But if you look more carefully on the origin of this project, it was defensive. And has to do with the reasons that I explained. The Americans are the thalassocratic power that controls the sea and could very easily block one strait, let's say the Strait of Malacca, that about 35% of the gold trade goes, and most of it goes to Asia, and most of it goes to China. So essentially, just with one strait, the Chinese economy will collapse, right? So the Chinese had to find alternatives. And the alternative was a continental road, or actually like octopus, many continental roads. But essentially it was a defensive measure dealing with American thalassocracy and the impact of them. In that case, on the Strait of Malacca, they found a solution, and also what the shipping industry found a solution in the Red Sea. But with the Strait of Hormuz, there's no solution. You see, if energy is being blocked there, there are not pipelines that they can bring the same amount of quantity outside of the Persian Gulf. And this is irreparable damage. That's why the game that is being played these days around the Iran and the United States and Israel and Iran, I think the industry should watch it very carefully, because it may have global repercussions.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Anyone like to pose any questions? Would you like to take one of the speakers?
I don't really need this, but no, the question I have, first of all, my name is Constantine Orfanos. The question I have is basically along the lines of this One Belt, One Road initiative, which of course we all know in the last 10, 15 years, the Chinese have spent tremendous amounts of capital to expand this, and it's worked very much in their favor. But now we're beginning to see the beginnings of the IMEC corridor, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, which, you know, some say it's to counter this, but at the same time, is it truly feasible? Is it something that really will come into play, or is this just more of a, you know, a Trumponian wish list type of situation?
Yep. Thank you. I think the idea behind the BRI, as Dr. Platias mentioned, it was initially defensive. I agree with him on that, but it's actually become a very global space in general. They've invested $1 trillion so far. It's officially a 50-year program. They've finished 10 years so far. So they've got another 40 years of investments, developments to go, and they have got a whole bunch of linkages that they are trying to look at. The IMEC, on the other hand, is essentially going to be very much dependent on the stability in the Middle East. The stability in the Middle East, including Israel getting involved in that discussion, has its own challenges. So what India has done is it has actually allowed the Indian companies to go and invest heavily in that specific region with the IMEC in the background. So Adani, for example, runs the Haifa port in Israel. So it's an Indian conglomerate which has taken contract of running the Haifa port with an intention to actually go ahead and consolidate and link up the other spaces. The rail portion of the Saudi part, as well as the UAE part, is under construction in any case, irrespective of whether the IMEC comes through or not. They are already investing heavily in that rail infrastructure. The sea corridor between India and the Middle East is also strengthened a lot, but there is, of course, challenges like we mentioned in the Straits of Hormuz. What's missing effectively is what happens after the Jordan and the Israel and that space comes, and then further out Eastern Mediterranean and going forward. So in reality, it's really that Middle East stability that they're waiting for, and then they will start moving in that direction. Their intention is not per se to try and counter the BRI. It's more about offering an alternative to Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is actually where they found that the hotspots have become so challenging that they are dependent on the European connection only through the Suez Canal, because Africa doesn't make sense. The route is too long.
Even the Israelis are talking about creating their own canal.
Yeah, and they want that, yeah. But at the end of the day, I think that's really where it is. The BRI, I think, is so far greater in scope, and it has a different connotation in terms of how they are looking at it now. The challenge with the BRI is very simple, that some of the players involved in the BRI are not yet fully available to take that growth forward. Like the Sri Lanka is a classic example. They got so badly burnt with the kind of debt that they incurred that they had to literally give the Hambantota away to Chinese for 99 years. That was not on the plan of the Sri Lankans. When the business was happening, maybe the Chinese had a plan like that, but the Sri Lankans never wanted to give a port away for 99 years. So in general, I think some of these potholes or roadblocks are there in BRI, but they are actually already very well entrenched in all these countries, whether it's with the infrastructure projects or whether it is with actual physical location of these places. This is a very interesting example that I would like to give. 2019 was the first year that China overtook every other country on earth of having the maximum number of diplomatic missions on ground around the world. 279, overtaking America and France, which are the number 2 and 3. They've not set up physical locations around the world for the fact that they want Chinese to go and spread the culture and the music there. They want to do business. And that is basically where Chinese are very different. They've got boots on the ground across the globe. The IMEC still doesn't have boots on the ground in the same way, except the Haifa port, which is now run by the Indians. That's basically where the difference really comes in. But I feel that both of them will come, but they might not fight with each other as such. My feeling there, yeah.
And if I may,
Add one.
certainly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Certainly.
Let me add a Greek interest type of dimension. First of all, the IMEC at the grand strategic level is an effort to bring India to the West rather than to the East. But it's reshaping Middle Eastern politics. Actually, different coalitions are being formed about the necessity of fighting in favor or against. In favor is Greece, it's Israel, United Arab Emirates, and India. Who is against? The Muslim countries, Turkey, that wants its own axis, Qatar, Pakistan, which goes against everything what India is doing. So actually a lot of the realignments that you see in the Middle East has to do around with this corridor and is being influenced Greek interest. Actually, we are being accused that we have made an axis with Israel and United Arab Emirates and India in order, to isolate Pakistan and Turkey and all these things. So a lot of Greek-related interest is being played around this project.
And the other thing which I wanted to add on the way the Chinese have developed the Belt and Road Initiative, and generally, what you mentioned about their planning and their foresight, because we have to give it to them. They have the planning, they have the foresight. Panama, Thanasi, how did the Chinese get into the Panama Canal? Basically, the Panamanians were tendering ports. They were tendering international tenders, inviting companies to come in, to operate ports, to put money, etc. The Americans were saying, what is this? The Chinese were going in, tendering, and they got the ports. Hutchinson and the other interests got the ports, not by force. They were up for tender. You mentioned, like Piraeus, you mentioned in your slide that Africa is a small little one line at the bottom of the Trump. What have the Chinese been doing in Africa? They've been there already the last 20 years. I saw a photograph today of a Simandu delegation. There was a Guinea flag, there was a Chinese flag, they were signing the contract, and all the faces were Chinese. All the faces were Chinese. So they were on the receiving end, the signing end, they were on the buying end. They've made the place theirs. So we have to, you said how the Chinese have grown over the last few years. They've grown and they'll keep growing, whether we like it or not. And for shipping, for all of us, because a lot of you will be wondering, what can we glean about what is happening in the marketplace? I guess it's a question which all of us want to know. And I would say that if you want to play shipping, go long.
Yes.
Because China and the way the globe is developing is very trade-centric. This is my point of view.
Absolutely, I agree. I think the disruptions will continue in some form or the other. I just wanted to share a very funny thing. The joke, because I come from Singapore, the joke in Singapore markets is that China cannot lose in the African continent because the biggest company that actually does business for China in the African continent is called Winning. There is no way that Winning can lose. So according to them, they've been very clear that we've been investing right from day one. Plus, I've got a couple of friends from Ghana, and they tell me that now, and this is official figures, the number of Chinese restaurants have exceeded all the other restaurants, type of restaurants in that particular country, which is crazy because it just goes to show that they've put foots on the ground, they've put boots on the ground, and they are really there to stay for a while, yeah? So remember that this is going to be, I would say, good for shipping because generally any kind of tussle like this creates inefficiencies, and if everybody gets along, they will just buy from the cheapest producer, the smartest places, and that's what shipping will probably have most efficient transportation spaces. The minute inefficiencies come in, I think shipping will benefit. That's the way it goes. Any other questions?
Anyway, Yanis.
Thank you. So looking at the slides that you showed us before, there was a slide with the American geopolitical structure for the future. And then you showed us a slide of an Israel-Iran conflict. If you look at the two together, you come to the conclusion that the closure of the Straits of Hormuz is inevitable. Is it?
Not necessarily. You see, this American strategy, which is different than the Israeli strategy, the American strategy is weakening Iran. The Israeli strategy is creating chaos, making like Libya, and essentially destroying it as a power actor. So if the American scenario prevails, that is essentially a weakening Iran, it's important to be there for a balance, because the threat of Iran, it keeps Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the other Sunni countries in control. So there is no, if I was a planner in Washington, I wouldn't have liked to take Iran out of the power equation. The Americans make the same mistake when they took Iraq out of the equation and they increased the power of Iran, as you remember with Bush. So I think Washington has the wisdom not to make this mistake again on try to completely make Iran state collapse. The Israelis, on the other hand, that are kind of fixated with the threat of Iran, they would have liked to see this scenario. So if the American scenario prevails, Iran is useful to be here, although weakened. In this scenario, the Strait of Hormuz will not be affected.
My question was about blocking the energy to go towards China. So the easiest way to make China suffer, or the Chinese economy to suffer, is to block the energy that flows out of the Persian Gulf with all this oil going to China. So the amount of oil that you showed us at the slide is enormous compared to the oil that goes to the America or to Europe.
Well, I implied with Venezuela and Iran that Chinese considerations are behind, and part of it is energy. For example, in Venezuela, it's not only throwing the Chinese out, but also using the 17% of global reserves that Venezuela has in order to power the American artificial intelligence revolution. On the case of Iran, the basic scenario for the United States is weakening and change the government and making pro-Western and pro-Israeli and anti-Chinese. That way, you get the same outcome that you are describing without having to create a geopolitical chaos in the area.
Wonderful. Can we have, yes, certainly.
Thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. I know you've been focused on China, on trade relationships, on long-term planning, the sheer size of the market, etc. Would you like to comment at all on the technological development? Because they are now world leaders in many of the new technologies. They're working on AI, they're working on digitalization, they're working on fuel sustainability within the country, so they're not relying on other sources, etc. So that is also part of the game going forward that we don't really consider many times. Thank you.
Well, as I said, for the first time, the United States had an opponent that looked the United States in the eyes, because it has the economic power, as I showed, has the demographic power. it has the military power, and has the technological power. And that's why the United States think that the trends are favoring China and tries to disturb. One way to disturb is through technological denial. So you see all these embargoes and restrictions to what China can get from the West, mostly on the field that the West is considered important, artificial intelligence. So they have restrictions on semiconductors. At the same time, China has a lot of advantages. I mean, it's building its own semiconductors, it has the energy, it has the engineer, and most importantly, it has the data, because it follows everybody, not only in China, but worldwide. So it gets a lot of data. So the whole game is being played really on semiconductors, and which model will be more effective. The Americans think that the Silicon Valley model of innovation will be more effective compared to the Chinese. Actually, one of the reasons that the Americans are mad with the Europeans is they think with their strategy on energy and with overregulation, what they do is they hinder the development and the power of the American technological giants, mostly in Silicon Valley, and that way indirectly they play the role of the Chinese. So one of the reasons that the Americans are concentrated on killing the European Union is because of its overregulation, and it's because on energy policy. So technology is really the linchpin of the competition, and it's something that the United States think that it has a dominance, and it does everything to preserve it. At the same time, as I said, the Chinese are using their leverage, mostly rare earths, in order to get technology that traditionally the Americans have declined, like the H20 NVIDIA chips. So it's also the geopolitics of energy that is being played, but the Americans still have the upper hand, despite the fact that the Chinese, in areas that they have decided to invest, like green technologies, have taken a lead. And that explains why Trump insists, drill, baby, drill. It insists on fossil fuels in order to shift the competition away from Chinese dominance.
I just had a couple of points which were additional to what Dr. Platia said. The Chinese, from the way we have seen, especially in the Asia side, they have been very clear with two things. Number one, they do not want to depend on the Western, not just American, but anybody from outside, especially Western technology, for their own internal use. So if you go into China even today and log into the hotel Wi-Fi, none of your traditional Apple, Google products work. Microsoft doesn't work. None of these things work. So they're pretty clear that you need to use your own stuff, which is basically dependence is gone. And they've benefited from this. There's a company in India called Nayara Energy, which is a joint venture between the Rosneft and the SR Oil and these guys. One fine day, they came into the office to realize that because of the sanctions on Rosneft and the other companies, Microsoft had simply switched off their servers because they said that you are basically owned partly by the Russian company, which is sanctioned. We can't do business with you. They had to go to the court in India to get the order to say this is Microsoft India, which doesn't follow the same sanction policy and therefore must restore our server connections. They've done that, but they had to go to the court to do that. Chinese do not face that problem. So number one, technology is basically a way of creating self-sufficient networks and apparatus infrastructure in China. They have succeeded in that. What they've not succeeded as much as the ability to go and export their technology to other countries, because the trust deficit is still quite heavy. People are not trusting the technology as much as they trust the other established players in Western and other places. So their export strategy is actually having a challenge specifically with regard to technology. But they're working on it, and the way they're working on it is the standard Chinese way of doing it. Just go and buy a company which is a Western company, and simply reroute their entire space through that company. So for example, today in automobiles, for example, you buy an MG, you think it's a British car. Nope, it's a Chinese car. You buy a Volvo, you think it's a Swedish car. Nope, it's a Chinese car. So at the end of the day, their idea is to use their global acquisition spaces to use technology to route it through the rest of their partners without showing it that it's a Chinese export. So that's their strategy. One, internally completely self-sufficient. Secondly, export, but through partners or through acquisitions. That's the way they look at it, yeah.
Wonderful. Shall we adjourn and go and have a nice drink? And if there are any further questions, we can discuss them over a drink and a snack. Well, thank you very much thank you, Puneet, thank you, Thanasi, and thank you everyone for being here.